Good morning. My name is Dr. Megan Paramaki-Brown, and this is my co-presenter, Dr. Sean Morton. We'd like to start by thanking the hardworking directors of Heritage Education Network Belize for putting on this symposium and inviting us to share our research with you.
Today we want to talk about architecture. And while architecture may appear static, changing only slowly from generation to generation, architectural expression stands among the most dynamic of human creations when viewed through the multi-generational lens of archaeology. It's a remarkably flexible medium for cultural expression that reacts to environmental and social and political and economic and ideological and functional and aesthetic pressures. Over the next 15 minutes, we'd like to introduce you to one such cultural expression, the ancient Maya architecture of East-Central Belize and the town of Alabama, which rose to regional prominence during the late to terminal Classic period, or about 700 to 900 AD. We'll endeavor to describe the set of rules, that is the cultural blueprint, that the builders of Alabama used in their task, and we'll speculate about how these might have developed. We'll also discuss our various approaches to understanding this development.
Along with our co-author, Dr. Gillian Jordan, we are co-directors of the Stann Creek Regional Archaeology Project, but many hands have conducted this research within the Stann Creek District, particularly men and women of Maya Mopan Village, who we have missed greatly over the past 2 years away from Belize. We hope this presentation reflects our ongoing collaboration with them.
By way of an introduction, the focus of much of our talk today is the ancient town of Alabama, whose original name remains unknown. The ancient inhabitants established this community in what is today East-Central Belize, a material culture subregion of the Maya lowlands, part of the eastern frontier of the Maya world, and roughly equivalent to modern-day Stann Creek District. Despite relatively little archaeological investigation in the region, and often grouped with southern Belize or Toledo District, the ancient towns of Stann Creek District shared several standard features. Such features are readily identifiable and collectively differentiate them from other lowland Maya towns and cities. These include locations atop alluvial terraces with less than a day's travel to coastal lagoons and shores along navigable rivers and overland trails, low, large, non-vaulted architecture, the use of alluvial clays in platform construction, large excavation pits delimiting monumental precincts, stone blocks, megalithic slabs, and stele altars made of non-limestone rock, a general lack of written texts, and special context use of imported limestone. Alabama is an archetype for this regional style and was first documented archaeologically in 1976 by Dr. Elizabeth Graham, one of the other speakers at this meeting and a former director of archaeology for Belize. In this presentation, we'll focus on the masonry platforms of the town. A discussion of buildings atop the platforms will have to await another talk, another time.
The downtown core of Alabama consists of 20 major structure platforms, the tallest, Structure 3, measuring about 7.5 meters in height, arranged around 4 plazas, with a short causeway and 14 uncarved granite monuments. This downtown zone measures slightly larger than that of Nimli Punit in southern Belize, and is only 1/10 the size of what must have been a bustling downtown at the most significant ancient city in Belize, Caracol. The site of Pierce, immediately to the north of Alabama in the Coxcomb Basin, is estimated to be slightly larger, roughly similar in size to Lubantun in southern Belize. Alabama and Pierce are currently the 2 largest documented sites in Stann Creek.
One of the first ways that archaeologists get at culture through architecture is by looking at it as a whole. What types of buildings and spaces are present? How are they arranged? Would this combination of structures and areas seem familiar to someone visiting from another community, and thus speak to similar cultural understandings of how a town should look or feel, or would it seem foreign? Archaeologists can do much of this without ever digging in the ground. Like most archaeological projects, ours devoted a considerable chunk of its early research time to producing a couple of maps to begin answering questions of just this type. Based on the available data from Alabama, it appears that, for the most part, structures in the downtown area were largely single-phase constructions. These single phases suggest that Alabama is unlike towns or cities such as Cajalpech or Lamanai, or a modern place like Belize City, built up over time, the product of multiple visions and changing historical, political, social, and cultural contexts. Places where builders superimposed new constructions and plans over old frameworks, particularly in the increasingly dense downtown zones. Instead, Alabama is akin to Belmopan, built relatively rapidly and presumably according to at least a general plan, with most additions and changes pushing the town out laterally across the landscape, and hence preserving the original vision of its planners. In this way, Alabama offers a snapshot of what residents saw as a proper and complete town, or at least the start of one.
Looking at this plan, we can see many expected features that would mark Alabama as Maya, as indeed British colonial architecture identifies Old Creole identity in Belize City, or thatched board houses on stilts proclaim Garifuna culture in Hopkins. Back in the day, a Maya visitor to Alabama's downtown, say from neighboring Toledo, would have recognized the principal platforms for temples and the relatively complex arrangement of the equally prominent residences of Alabama's rulers. Visitors may have desired to hip-check a ball in Alabama's centrally placed ball court, and they certainly would have been familiar with the arrangement of structures around several interconnected plazas. That the houses and fields of commoners surrounded this downtown zone would also have felt more or less correct. But so too, there are differences that may have marked Alabama and its inhabitants as distinct to a visitor, broadcasting her unique character, just as San Ignacio is different from Dangriga. For instance, the orientation of Alabama's downtown is different from many of its neighbors, running east-west, as is also the case at Pierce. This east-west orientation is relatively rare in ancient Belize, where north-south tends to be the norm. We note exceptions at some ancient towns in the Cayo district, such as Buena Vista and Pacbitun. We might suggest that Alabama's builders had cultural or historical ties to this region, though this is speculative at best.
The location of Alabama in an alluvial valley bottom would have also stood out, at the same time familiar and foreign to a visitor from contemporary Toledo. Specifically, this valley bottom location stands in sharp contrast to other prominent southern towns and cities, such as Lubantun and Nimli Punut, where residents chose to live on restricted hilltops. The dispersed houses and garden plots stretching across the valley bottom and patchwork of milpas extending into the surrounding hills would have likely felt more familiar to a visitor from the Belize Valley. One of our discipline's most prominent scholars, Eric Thompson, observed that early historical Mopan and Kekchi Maya communities in southern Belize preferred different geographic locations on the landscape, alluvial bottoms versus hilltops respectively, a pattern still observed today. Could it be that we're observing a distinct Maya ethnic group at Alabama, and perhaps in East-Central Belize in general, compared to ancient southern Belize?
Other unique details of Alabama's settlement may support this idea. For instance, the spacing and arrangement of households across the valley bottom differ from sites in the Toledo district, or the fact that Alabama households tend to have fewer associated structures, which may suggest different preferences or practices, a different rhythm in daily life compared to neighboring regions. Whereas in many areas, household work was segregated into other distinct structures or locations, so cooking here, sleeping there, crafting over there, at Alabama, residents may have integrated many of their daily activities within a single space. Additionally, extended families may not have been the norm for households, unlike in other regions. These are cultural choices that would have resulted in a distinctly different-looking community from other parts of the Maya world. Again, this remains as speculation.
Now, eventually, archaeologists do what archaeologists do best, and that is dig. During excavations, scrap team members were quick to point out other unique features of the architecture at Alabama, and indeed in the region as a whole, related to the material choices and cultural practices associated with construction.
Most people who have visited an ancient Maya site would be familiar with platforms or even superstructures, the actual buildings, temples, palaces, houses that one can walk inside on top of these platforms that were made of white limestone. If you've been particularly observant, you may have even seen small sections of the preserved plaster and paint that once coated these structures. Reconstruction drawings, such as the one on the slide, effectively resurrect these places in all their glory. Suppose you've Suppose you've ever been on an archaeological dig in the Maya world or have visited a site when archaeologists have had excavations going. In that case, you may have noticed that, for the most part, the platforms that surround you were largely solid. While they sometimes contained tombs or spaces for ritual offerings, their primary job was to lift buildings skyward, away from rainy season floodwaters, and for the largest of structures in the downtown zone, into the spotlight where everyone could see them. You may have also recognized that the solid cores of these platforms tend to be composed of rough limestone boulders and marl.
In other words, the ancient Maya built the architecture that we know and love out of limestone. They expressed their cultural practice and construction via their knowledge of working with this material, developed over more than a millennium. But what happens when there is no limestone? How might culture and practice adapt? Alabama and other sites in East-Central Belize, a region dominated not by limestone but by granites and their derived clays, provide an example. As a result, the builders put many unique cultural features on display. The general form of structures accords with expectations for Maya cultural practices seen elsewhere. The methods of construction were also generally similar. They made use of loose and consolidated construction core deposited by the basket load, sometimes penned in by masonry of uncut stone, in turn faced by cut and trimmed blocks which were plastered over. As was the inclusion of ritual and ceremony in the building process, so we found copal in the construction core common. However, the specific materials used were significantly different. Rather than limestone and marl, the ancient people of Alabama used clays for the cores of their buildings, much of which they excavated from pits immediately surrounding the downtown core or nearby the construction site. In fact, we can even see such features in recent LiDAR imagery from the site of Pierce. They faced their structures with pecked granite derived from nearby stream beds. A study conducted by Miss Virginia Cheok demonstrates that builders shaped granite stones to a relatively consistent size across the site and over time. Lacking limestone to make plaster, it appears that the builders of Alabama used a white clay instead, and we're currently trying to better understand this type of construction. Limestone does make an appearance at the site, used exclusively in unique contexts such as ball court markers, and presumably imported at great expense. This represents a tie to broader Maya traditions elsewhere.
The builders of Alabama were also innovative. During excavations, we occasionally encountered a mortar of clay and what looked like crushed granite between and behind stones. At the 2019 Sakut's Cultural Fair, we enlisted the help of some energetic volunteers to see what it would take to shape granite blocks using quartzite hammerstones. In addition to proving that an individual could shape a single block in just a few hours with enough effort, the experiment produced fine grit and larger chips of stone. Under the microscope, it appears that this byproduct material was the primary component in the previously identified mortar. This use of what might be considered waste from block manufacture suggests a value of sustainable and resourceful practices among ancient builders. The use of mortar may have been a preferred solution for dealing with structural instability associated with seasonal heaving and shrinking in the clay-filled platform, along with strategic interlocking block work. Additionally, a switch to primarily rubble core construction, alluvial cobbles and boulders, in platforms and plazas occurs later in the town's history and is likely also a way to deal with platform shifting as well as flooding, a problem still today in Stann Creek, by improving drainage.
Another remarkable feature of Alabama is that these material choices and construction techniques are consistent across socioeconomic divides in the town. Regardless of structure size, they can be found in the humblest of commoner houses to those of the town's rulers. The same culturally defined template seems to have been in use.
In our attempt to get our heads around the particular challenges and solutions of building a Maya town in this region, we have collected physical evidence for construction techniques and material choices from our excavations. However, we also informally chat with people living in the region today, both Maya and non-Maya, observe how they use available materials, and even help out with construction projects when we can. Taking all of this information together, we drew up this little infographic. Bringing us back to the language we used at the start of the presentation, this is a set of instructions, if you will, for building a structure at Alabama and in East-Central Belize material culture tradition. It represents our current best guess for describing a broad set of cultural practices behind Alabama's architectural blueprint. It is a model that we will refine as the slow edge of the trowel peels back further details of Alabama's structures. It represents a burgeoning understanding of processes that further experimentation and input from collaborators, colleagues, and the public will help deepen. So thank you very much, Botik, and we look forward to any input that you might have.